But perhaps these comments also reflect an even greater fear. The fear of movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter or the Dreamers that operate beyond the control of what Cutrone and companies deem left. Perhaps these movements have become too uppity in the eyes of some leftists, and they welcome Trump's assault. There's little difference in my mind between a Nazi and a Nazi apologist, a Trumpist and a Trump apologist. Once you apologize for something long enough, you become that thing.
No, so there's a little difference between. Yeah, he did. And there's no difference between a liberal apologist and a liberal then.
It is another episode of Pop Left with me, Douglas Lain, and
Derick Varn.
If you want to know how I'm feeling today, let me show you something. When I go like this is it. This is my. I've turned into. I need a haircut, but also I've been pulling my hair. I had an incident with YouTube. I created a video. I uploaded the video. No, this is objectionable. This isn't suitable for most advertisers. We're going to demonetize this. So I went through the video piece by piece and tried to find what I thought were objectionable aspects of the video, right? And I edited those out, like shots of people carrying guns, mentions of the American Empire. And then I re-uploaded each section until each section was monetized as an unlisted video. I put it all together, uploaded again. Guess what, Derick?
They said that you did not meet monetized criterion.
Yeah, they demonetized me again, even though each part of it was monetizable. So yeah, go watch the video. I'm going to put a link to it. All right. So enough about that. So Derick, I originally asked you to come on again. We're going to do this every month, but I wanted to discuss logic and reason. It was after having interviewed Chris Cutrone where I ended up in a position where he was accusing me of being kind of like an analytic philosopher and having too much faith, not even full on Aristotlean logic, just, insisting on arguments that make sense, trying to avoid fallacies and things like that. And my objection to him at the time was not that, I think, and it's certainly my objection now, is that not that I thought everything could be settled simply like a logic problem or like mathematically. If you just had the right axiom, you could figure out the truth. But that it was, necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah.
To use arguments and to avoid fallacies. You don't throw away what Hegel called mere understanding in the process of doing dialectics.
No. And in fact, I like to talk a little bit about what Hegelian dialectics really is, because dialectics as a tradition develops in Indian schools of argumentation and logic. It develops in ancient Greek schools of argumentation and logic. And what dialectics is in a formal sense before Hegel, and that's important. We got to put the asterisk on that. Now, really before Kant, all right, is where you have contested terminology, all right, and you engage in a dialogue to debate the validity of the terminology.
This sounds like Socrates to me.
Yes, actually, the Socratic dialogues are classical dialectics, as are like the Melinda Pata, etc. What Hegel does is, for reasons that are complicated through going through Kant, and we read, and we're going to apply this to some degree, but we read Aristotle's, Kant's, and Hegel's Logic, part 1, the logic of Aristotle and Kant. is actually
Yeah,
really...
I read part 2 because I got to the end of part 1. I was like, no, this isn't enough. I got to read what he said. Of Hegel. But anyhow, go ahead.
There's a little bit in there that I think that's interesting, that reminds me why Hegel did have to reintroduce dialectics, but how he did it, which was dialectics as evolving in time, to add history as a vector in the reasoning, because of the problems of not just synthetic a priori, and just remind people what that is. An analytic a priori.
Why don't we start with Aristotle a little bit? Just like what was the problem that Aristotle was trying to overcome? Because he spends a great deal of time on
Aristotle's trying to get beyond the Pythagorean and Platonic need for forms to eternally exist for argumentation to be true. It's not that Aristotle rejected their forms; he just rejected that. Basically, we could deduce all logic from eternal truths derived from geometry.
Right. And the epistemic thing that he was trying to overcome was the way in which we arrive at the forms, or true understanding would be through just remembering.
Right.
And so he was trying to develop an approach to understanding that would be active and present rather than
passive.
And passive, right?
Because is it the Timaeus? It is the Timaeus and Plato. Plato's answer to epistemology is like, you already know everything. A veil of ignorance has been laid upon you in your birth, and you are just uncovering it. Right? That's his argument. So metaphysics is ontology, is actually epistemology for Plato. They're different ways of saying the same thing.
Yeah, I don't ever understand the difference between metaphysics and ontology. It's been explained to me lots of times, and I never get it. But ontology being epistemology seems like a major thing to me. But anyhow, go on.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're collapsing. Justified true belief is the translation for what Plato believes that knowledge is, but justification is experience of the forms. Plato's uncomfortable with this, and we know Plato's uncomfortable with it because in the Parmenides, Parmenides actually defeats the argument.
Right.
So
in a very convoluted and strange and Alice in Wonderland kind of way, but
I mean, it is weird, and it's one where you have to actually kind of know all the kind of crypto for us, but not for them, are what we might say quasi-religious ideas that are going on in Plato. Aristotle wants to minimize what we might call the quasi-religious ideas, are the metaphysical assumptions. Like, the he does have them, the unmoved mover, emanation, etc. But he's trying to get like how we base reasoning down to as little as possible. And the problem is pretty clear pretty instantly, though, is the kind of logic he develops, and his, I think, 6 works that actually touch on logic, can't actually deal any better with primary axioms than the forms do. Although I think teleology is a little, teleos, cause oisha, and I'm butchering the Greek. I don't know how to speak Greek, but
yeah, I just looked at it and saw, I recognize that squiggle
right
from one sentence to the next.
What that's about is trying to find like a way to talk about validity of concepts, and validity of concepts is applied to objective truth. So what is that? Well, we can talk about what is necessary and what is sufficient. Well, sufficient conditions can be accidents, according to Aristotle. So can accidental things. But what is necessary is what is both true to the thing, all right, and true to the thing in all time. And if you can universalize it, it is true to the thing in all time. So it's like 3 criterion. And unfortunately, I'm not sure I know the Greek words because the paper we had left the Greek in Greek. But so that's how you get the idea of the teleology. What is true to a thing that is unique to it? I forgot the uniqueness criterion, but is true in all instances, in all cases. All right. And so the teleos of the thing is what it exists for. It exists for the thing. It's what is both unique and universal to it. Now, there's all kinds of problems with that. I mean, it's not hard to see the problems with that. I mean, people saw the problems with it at the time. But it does lay down like some kind of criterion for testing concepts. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And it stands for in Islamic and Christian, and Neoplatonic even, thinking, it stands as valid logic for about, 1700 years, 1800 years. It's a long time. Now there's ironies to this is as Hegel, well, as the author notes that Hegel notes that if you actually were strictly using Aristotelian logic, all of Aristotle's deductions about like biology, which is most of what he actually wrote, he wouldn't have done because they don't actually fit his logical criteria. Mm-hmm. But, nonetheless, it does give you a grounds of dealing with concepts, or particularly when you add the law of non-contradiction. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you get to Kant and Hume, happening at the same time, start to realize that this Aristotelian predicate logic and then deduction. Once Descartes come up with his self-referential basis for knowledge,
mm-hmm.
you got a problem because you can't justify a priori synthetic statements. So a posteriori synthetic statements are statements based off of experience,
mm-hmm.
Objectively told. So we have to remember that Kant breaks down statements about experience into subjective statements and objective statements.
Mm-hmm.
Subjective statements is I perceive the rock is, and this is what's used in the paper. This is also
the way I think of it. These are kinds of claims,
right?
Rather than justified true beliefs in either instance, right? There's
mm-hmm.
the claim, the sun hit the rock and the rock got warm. That's a subjective claim.
Mm-hmm.
And the objective claim would be when sunshine hits rocks, they become warm.
Right.
That's the objective claim. That's a universalization of the experience.
And the British empiricists hit a problem, and this problem is stated by Hume. Mm-hmm. Even though, they're scientific, Hume's problem that you can't truly make a statement inductively that is true in all cases based off your own experience, aka you can't arrive at a synthetic a priori based off an experience, is a huge problem for philosophy, even philosophy of science, because it's like you if you assume that, you cannot assume there is ever any predictability to anything.
Right. And to say that in really plainly, the assumption is that what's happened in the past will continue to happen in the future. Mm-hmm. That's all it is. It's like, because I've seen this happen umpteenth number of times, the sun hits a rock, the rock becomes warm. I assume it's going to behave the same way in the future when sunshine hits rocks, so become warm. And we don't have any justification for that belief that the future will resemble the past.
Yeah, none.
Mm.
Which makes getting to axioms really hard. So there's a couple of ways in English philosophy, there's a couple of ways they tried to handle this. One is presuppositionalism. which is you just have to assume some kind of basis for being and go with it. It's actually often used by Christians. The other is abduction, which is kind of a probabilistic argument that we can say something is true inductively because it is probabilistically true. That's a 20th century third kind.
How is that? How do people think that gets around the problem?
I don't think it gets around the problem. I think it's like, it's kind of a cop out. It's like, well, mathematically we can say, and here's the problem with it. And this is a problem Kant realizes. Okay, you want to have probability as your answer for that, but how do you justify math? Because math, to get back into our categories here, analytic concepts are a priori. Like, I can't have a square circle. That's category error because of the definitions, right? The definitions are incompatible. That there's nothing synthetic about that. I didn't experience squares. Like, anytime you have an abstract that you have to rely on a definition, you're dealing with a synthetic a priori. And this is why when I talk about a lot of, like, when we talk about like sociological concepts, it's like, well, what's the criterion of cohesiveness, right? All right, because that's how you test a synthetic a priori. Is it in contradiction with itself? Do you have definitions that are inconsistent, etc.? And that those truths are just analytic truths, right? Tautologies are analytic truths. When you're doing conceptual analysis or analytic truths. Now, how do we then deal with like concepts that are contested? All right, that's one problem. We talked about classical dialectics, which is basically we argue about it.
But if we have Aristotlean logic, we argue about it in a particular way.
Right. But again, if you get down to the axiomatic assumptions in Aristotelian logic, if you're not dealing with teleology, right? You still don't have any way to decide what the axioms are going to be. I can prove that the axioms are false if they contradict each other, and that's a huge gain, right? But I can't prove, like, if I say no, 1 equals 2, all right, like that's a shift. How do I adjudicate that? Well, I can say, okay, well, the definition of 1 is the quanta of 1 being. It is both necessary and sufficient and universalizable to this definition, therefore blank, right? And the definition of 2, okay, but what if I start to collapse those? And there are ways mathematically, and I'm not going to get into them, you can start to collapse them. Through basically running the math, usually through calculus, and ways to start bending the concepts.
I want to tell you a story to kind of illustrate what you're saying in a real kind of personal way, okay? And it has to do, I recorded a conversation with Susanna Kleeman yesterday, and we were discussing Baudrillard. And I started the conversation by saying, listen, the way I conceive of Baudrillard is blah, blah, blah. You know, he broke from Marxism. He misunderstood Marx. I read his book on Marxism, got the categories wrong, blah, blah, blah. And her reaction to that was, you know, that I was just trying to presume an authoritative stance.
No, it's not.
Right. But that's what her reaction was like, oh, yes, King Doug, I know you know more than I do. Oh, yes. Now, and she got, you know, she really likes Baudrillard, and she was upset with me. And now, admittedly, I had begun by asserting. I didn't begin with an argument that I laid out, you know, and saying, but the reason I didn't was because in order to go through one of the arguments that I might have against Baudrillard, I would have had to take a lot of time to do it. It just would have taken a lot of time, and I would do, you know, it was a back and forth conversation. But maybe the other reason I didn't was because I egotistically wanted to presume some authority. But here's the thing that got me as we went through the conversation, is she pointed out how today, getting to the end of an argument is how I'll put it, or dealing with the data or having enough information so that you can know that you've just on an analytic level understood something has become practically impossible for most people and maybe all of us on about certain things, right? And Baudrillard points this out when he talked about the obesity of information. Like, you'll ask for the data, empirical data from a company. The government says, hey, oil company, give us all the data, your data about what your activities were over the last year. And you get a warehouse full of documents. So, and that also occurs, I've noticed, in online discourse, because that's pedantry. It's the problem there. Like you get down to an endless battle over definitions and arguing about minutia, but to try to say no, we're going to stop here. We don't need to keep debating these terms. Seems like an imposition. There's no argument or justification for it. And so the question you have is, at what point do we all just end up starting from intuition? How do we, or insert, and which is another way of saying asserting authority?
Yeah. Are the concepts being spoken about related to each other in actuality? So just because something uses the same word as something else and thinks it refers to the same thing, when you look at how the concept is being employed in one case set and being employed in another, you see if the conditions of their employment are the same. And if the conditions of their employment are different, even if this person is talking about what this person is saying, you can say objectively, they are misrepresenting the terminology because the case sets are differently. You do not have to go through infinite information to do that. And in fact, in analytic categories, the criterion is, does this make sense? And does X align to X? So if you're saying value is value as it is a capital volume 1, what are the case conditions which that word emerges? And luckily, one of the confusing things about capital that you really have to understand is it is argued both through the science of logic from Hegel, but it's also, properly speaking, even in the old school sense, dialectical, meaning that Marx wants to define his terms by walking through cases of the argument set out by Smith to go through it and then show that, okay, we've seen from this, and this. What emerges from this is this concept is valid because it corresponds. Marx's materialism has a kind of a rough correspondence, like ideas. This is different from Hegel, but it is important to understand. But we can see from this concept called commodity emerges from this set of arguments. We can apply this, run through it, and then arrive at the definition. Now, it is maddening in certain cases because you go through all 3,000 words or more. I mean, not 3,000 words, 3,000 pages of capital. And for example, he doesn't ever actually derive working class from its description. He just continuously describes it. And stuff like that, because he didn't finish the text, right? That's maddening, totally maddening. But for commodity and value and stuff, we have those case conditions actually fairly thoroughly from Marxist description. I will admit, though, asterisks on value, Marxist descriptions are contestable even using Marxist terms. But what we can say is that given the case sets in Marx, even if there's ambiguities about those case sets, value form versus this versus TSSI versus SSI, whatever, that none of those include subjective valuing, as in to just care for something or for something to be worth something personally.
Right. And you're referring to Baudrillard's approach to value, right? Yeah. And okay, so so there we can find yes. But I feel as though if I was Suzanne Kleeman, I would say, well, basically, so what is what you would say to that, which I don't think is justifiable, but because what I would have to demonstrate to her is, look, the reason why it matters that Baudrillard gets these concepts wrong is because he's beginning with a critique of Marx. He's not
Right. If he
beginning
was
somewhere
just
else.
employing a concept of value, it is irrelevant if he has the same definition of Marx. That's actually why I talk about like we have to be nominalist, and I'm putting in quotation here because I don't actually mean formally speaking nominalist in like the 11th century sense.
Right,
but when we talk about class, when we deal with non-Marxist class theories, because their case conditions are different, how they define the term is different, they're just not talking about the same thing. And we can know that, right? Like, and so we can use that to disaggregate when we're talking past each other, because they're using one definition that gives you a different set of criterion, and this is going to turn out different sets of answers to the problem, and you're using another set. Now, we can eternally argue about which one is more real, right? The reason why Marx talks about class, at least the two classes we're specifically talking about in Capital, the bourgeoisie, and its various forms, and there's a couple of forms in there, and the workers are the proletariat in its form, is because for Marx in our society, so since those are primary divisions, they're also clear divisions. And when you get into other cases, petit bourgeois, surplus army of labor, lumpen, all of those are fuzzier. All right. That's why sometimes neo-Marxists may call them social categories, because they don't have the same operational conditions. I think that's clarifying. That's actually not what Marx does, but that is clarifying. My only point about that is that it's because Marx thinks that we can understand both their position, what is necessary, right? A proletariat produces commodities, but does not get to keep those commodities. Thus, it does not have capital. All right. It cannot capitalize upon any surplus extracted from commodity exchange, and bourgeoisie can. All right. So in that sense, since we have something that is both universal to those two categories and unique to those two categories, at least when we're dealing with them in context to each other, we can say this is an objective class distinction.
I mean, if we take it out of the context of just Marxism in general, you can establish whether or not you're talking about the same thing,
right?
And if you're not, then you can at that point realize that the argument that you're having is not going to be fruitful. And if someone's claiming to be talking about the same thing, and you can demonstrate they're not, then you've demonstrated that what they're saying isn't true.
Absolutely,
right?
It is not just in analytic circles. We might call that it's not even wrong. It's not. It's just not a thing. It's not true, not because it is wrong, but because it is meaningless. And why is it
okay? Let me ask you this. I mean, because when I say, "Oh, a dog is an animal you put a saddle on and ride around," aren't I just being wrong there? I mean, rather than not even wrong.
I guess, yeah. If you, in the sense that you are dealing with an objective check on a definition, I
guess when you're not even wrong is when you start with a dog as a horse, and then you throw in that a barn is a skyscraper,
right?
You just collect all these things, and then you make a system out of it that is not related to any part of the usual definitions of the term,
right?
But and claim that you are.
The problem that I have with Baudrillard in general is that sometimes I think he's actually quite insightful, but there are times where he'll say things like capitalism is over because he was saying this in like 2005, 2006, the book that was published in 2010. And I'm like, objectively speaking, what he just said is false. Like, because he's saying there's no more turn of the value chain because workers don't matter because it's all a simulation, simulacra, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And so what you have is a series of assertions, and they are just assertions. He often does not actually argue his case. He just asserts it. And while I do think, like, I also like parts of Baudrillard, but I also think some of it's frankly.
Oh, I like Baudrillard aesthetically.
Right.
And I think there's some observations about society that hit home, that seem true, even when I try to take some distance from that because, how am I being narcissistically rewarded by agreeing with Baudrillard? I try to ask, but nonetheless, my critique bringing up Baudrillard was sort of a distraction. The point was that what you want to do is establish a way to have a dialectic that isn't based on mere assertion at any point. That isn't just about opinions at any point.
And also isn't totally dependent when we talk about concepts on empirical data, because the idea that, yes, we have information obesity, but that's actually irrelevant. At any period of time, if you're deriving all concepts from empirical experience, you have too much information to generate concepts. There's just no way to do it. And this is why the whole Kantian,
Kant comes along and says, well, look, there are some concepts which we have empirical access to.
Right.
Those are the synthetic a prioris.
Synthetic a prioris.
Of time, of mass. These are things
that are,
but they're conceptual.
And then there are analytic categories of which basically Aristotelian and post-Aristotelian predicate logic applies. These are conceptual truths. These are analytic a prioris. So you have synthetic a posterioris, that's what we know from observation. Analytic a prioris, which is what we know by definition. All right. Basically, like we test the definitions and the concepts off of their coherence and criteria. All right. So that's an analytic category, and then you have a synthetic category, which is the synthesis is with the observation with the outside world. That's even what the concept there is referring to. But then you have a problem, and that problem is synthetic a prioris. Why are they a problem? Because a priori means prior to experience. Synthetic means synthesized with the outside world, as far as Kant's concerned. Let me give you an example why this is important. Math itself is a synthetic a priori. In some ways, this
because number is right,
because number is, like, we know the number to be true by synthesis. We apply it to things, and we know that there's like one apple because we know the concept of one, but that's an a priori. Like, there's no way to, the idea, for example, that numbers exist in nature gets you into all kinds of metaphysical problems immediately, which is why
it's built into the notion of it being something that it arrives as a concept a priori before the experience,
right?
But that the concepts, our experience relies upon these categories, but we can't have an experience without them. But because of that, because they are the conditions of possibility for experience, these are the conceptual conditions of possibility. Then, we can see that we aren't justifying them through experience,
right?
And then the question is, how are those synthetic a priori categories justified, and what do they relate to? What justifies their truth? Right. And he basically ends up saying, well, the noumenal world, which we have no access to, but have to posit.
So he basically doesn't get out of the problem.
Right.
Like, because he's like, okay, we can know synthetic a priori from experience, i.e., we have a definition of one, and we see an apple, and we know that there's one apple. That's easy. But do we know what appleness is? This leads to what is later called the quanta qualia distinction. All right. So like, but it's really kind of bigger than that. That's why it's like,
because it turns out there is no quanta. If I'm remembering quanta qualia right, there's no like, I think of the quanta qualia distinction as the distinction between like Locke that said, colors are concepts which arise within our mind. They're not actually out in the world beyond us.
Right.
And that's qualia, right?
There's objective conditions that generate colors, but we cannot experience.
But the colors themselves are a product of our mind.
Right. They're
products. But there's a lot of things that we can like demonstrate that way. The optical illusions demonstrate the way in which certain things are products of our mind. So, but in any case, the issue here is, for me, I'm willing to bracket out the absolute truth, meaning like a Hegelian absolute truth, and still say, okay, I'm struggling with this. I feel as though, the question for me is, does Hegel solve the problem? Does he manage not to end up with mere assertion or intuition or opinion in the end of, say, the phenomenology or in with the logic? Does his logic become the solution for the problem, which is, I think, is what he says. But that question is, we can assume that it does. Let's say that we're good Marxist dogmatists, and we assume that it does, okay, because we're Hegelian Marxists, okay. If we assume that it does, that doesn't mean, and this is aimed at Chris Cutrone, that we can operate at the level of the absolute without also preserving what Hegel would call mere understanding, or the analytic tradition, or
we have not transcended where, like, that's an unfortunate term here, but we have not gone beyond the need for predicate logic, symbolic logic, etc. The difference between what, say, a post-Hegelian or Hegelian, and I say post-Hegelians too because they're part of this, and a Anglo-American analytic traditionally is not Kant, because Kant kind of sets the whole thing off. And it is the fact that the historicism in German thinking, and in Hegel in specific, they want to do away with. So they want to be able to say that we could arrive at truths for all time. And Hegel's assertion is basically not really, but we are always getting closer through it through negativity, which is, a very long.
Isn't that negativity itself a universal truth for all time?
Yeah, but that would be the absolute, manifest in negation, and in overcoming that negation, you Aufhebung or sublate, as we are called here.
The way I understand it is that when we arrive at the absolute as human beings, what we arrive at is the understanding of our own participation and creation of the world, and the transitory nature of the truths that we'll arrive at, but also the direction in which we'll also be consciously assuming responsibility for the direction that goes.
Right.
And we won't be abandoning. It's not like the negation won't be an erasure. It will be a transcendence each time. That's how I understand the concept of
right. Self-actualization is like, is a kind of negation that approaches to Hegel the absolute. What becomes a problem for Marxists is we don't really believe in a non-material absolute, and that's where things get murky. That's what turning Hegel on its head means. Like Marx,
but my understanding, the solution to that, I'm sorry, but my understanding of the solution to that is that Marx says we do have a non-material absolute, but that absolute is.
I would love to tell me where that's said.
Well, maybe you're right, but this is what I think. This is what I infer.
Okay,
from reading Marx, it's not what I can say he absolutely wrote out, but we have this non-material absolute, which is human subjectivity, and which sets up our social relationships, right? Our creative capacities socially, which tend to get reified. But if we, in other words, we start to take them to be, natural for all time. But the fact of our social relations setting up the terms in which we will interact with the material world and reproduce ourselves is the absolute. That so our it's again, that's the subjectivity. That's not out there, in atoms, or it's with the consciousness, the social consciousness of humanity.
Which is why one, Marxists are not, well, they weren't. I have to caveat everything after all to say, but Marxists, even though they believe in even though historically most Marxists have believed in the inevitability of communism, brackets, Marx says multiple things that contradict each other on that, on brackets, but Marxists generally have until the 1950s. One thing we can say for sure is that Marxist answer to flipping Hegel on his head, right? Is materialism, but materialism here is not mere materialism. It is historical materialism. It's also not mere historicism. All right. And that's the difference. And we can think about what's included in the basic.
What's the difference between mere historicism and historical materialism?
That's a good question, because I have been going through, separately from anything you've asked me to do, the German historical philosophers and historical economists. So these are neo-Kantians, are right-wing Hegelians, and the historical philosophers. And the historical economists are people like Gustav Smoller, Max Weber, Bernard Sombart. A lot of them actually were Marxist and reverted back to a different form of thinking. So historical economists, for example, they're statist. They view societies as historically instantiated. They also think that you have to operate with norms. Those norms are reinforced in your economic policies, and these are enclosed in a singular system, i.e. the state complex and its historical instantiation. Now, Marxists don't think that. Marxists don't think that you can just do whatever in a closed system like that.
No. But there are certain things that they do think, like you have to have norms. And what was the first thing you said in that list of things they believe?
Norms, that the state is the determiner of the economic conditions, which no, we don't.
No, we don't think that.
Although a lot of Marxists now currently do, but they don't realize how far off base they are. That historical society is very instantiated. Now, if you think about
the society is historically instantiated. I have to ask you, what does that mean? Because it seemed to me Marx.
That's almost circular, but Marx does that. For example, stage theories of history. Smoller and co would be like, yeah, of course there's stages, but we set up the norms for those stages. But they're completely encapsulated, like they're coherent according to.
They don't have contradictions.
They don't have contradictions. It's just about setting norms. And I mean, I've talked about the relationship between neo-chartalism and Lassalleanism before, but these are the same people. Knapp, the founder of chartalism, which is, where MMP and all that comes from, was of the second generation of historical school economists. And if you think about their theory of state money as completely separate from any other, overarching system, it's like an enclosed system in the way they model it. It's very consistent with this. Marxists don't do that. Why aren't we mere materialists? Chris Cutrone, when I was in Platypus, used to say, "You are a bad materialist." By that he meant you are too materialist. You do not understand the historical instantiation. Okay, well, what did he mean by that? The best way to understand this is to illustrate.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the illustration. If you are a Newtonian materialist and you believe in both individual and social determination, everything that is would always be and will always be, and there's nothing you can do about it, including, for example, when I've pointed this out to people, if you take this logic to its ultimate conclusion, including arguing against stuff like free will. It's like, well, but it doesn't matter. I'm always going to argue that a compatibilist state. You're always going to argue ultra-determinism state. This argument itself is irrelevant because we could be nothing else. It is actually, in some ways, I'm like, it's a self-negating philosophy, in that if you take it seriously, there's no reason to do the philosophy. You can't convince anybody of anything because everything is as it always will be from the moment of the first particle break, etc. Marxists don't believe that. That is very clear. We don't believe that. And the reason why we don't believe that is we think the base and superstructure metaphor is confusing because it's a feedback loop. And Engels says that over and over again. But the reason why we don't believe that is that we believe that we have the ability we do have agency as individuals. The agency, if it can instantiate itself, if something can understand itself and act for itself through collective agency, other means, institutions, etc., you can meaningfully speak about collective agency. Otherwise, you're speaking about aggregation.
Mm-hmm.
And as Marx says, history is made in aggregates. Like, it's just the importance of history is not what individuals do, but what whole systems and things do. But let's get to the importance of the difference between historical materialism and mere materialism. In historical materialism, I am in a feedback loop of my environment, but I do have the ability to change my environment. And my environment also includes, in Marxist materialism, social relations. So the way we reproduce society, right? That is necessary. So Marxist materialism is formal in the sense that it's not merely like monist, substance and in total determination. It is, we have agency to some degree. It is limited by our historical conditions, but we actually change our historical conditions by the way we remake the world. And we do that in two ways, both physically altering the world technologically and socially altering the way we relate to each other to reproduce the materials we need.
Right. The difficulty for Marxists and people who want to create socialism is that at present, we continue to reproduce the same social relationships again and again and again. And that those social relationships, when you look at them as a system, I mean, Spencer Leonard tells me Marx didn't have a concept of the system, but when you look at the logic of,
if you want to make Spencer Leonard happy, if you look at the logic of the totality,
logic of the totality, you'll find that it's got a primary contradiction, and that because of that, the way I'd put it is the aims of the society that help create the material conditions, like the aim of freedom, for individuals, which is necessary for the system to arise, are undermined by the logic of the totality.
So for example, there's a bourgeois right of free speech. Why is the bourgeois right of free? I'm doing you on purpose, but it's actually, it's actually, why is it insufficient? It's not that it's wrong. All right. Marx actually spent a whole lot of his life arguing about why free speech is good. But the caveat that he always puts on it is like, okay, but because of the ownership of the means of production and ownership entailing other kinds of rights like association, etc., I can never truly have free speech as long as like the means of speech in a Marx times of the print press is privately owned, because I cannot, under those rights, actually assert my ability to spread my speech. Now, how liberals respond to that is generally they go all negative rights. Well, free speech is freedom from coercion against saying something. We don't have to give you the ability to distribute it in all cases. And so that's, it becomes merely a formal right, like a formal bourgeois right, not a substantive right. That's kind of what's going on when we talk about the contradiction. Like that's just one form of it. It's not a primary contradiction, but it's a result.
Right. That's a good example. And just to take the bait a little bit, in the current moment, when I've been up in arms about state censorship of social media and the partnering of social media companies with the security state, which I think has been pretty firmly established that has happened. To the degree to which that partnership has always meant that the state just calls all the shots is not clear. That isn't the case, actually, but nonetheless, there's a partnership between the security state and these big companies. When I am objecting to that, I'm not saying, oh, well, once we, push back the state, the conditions of freedom that we have under capitalism, under the, on Facebook are sufficient. I'm just saying, this is the loss of even the formal freedom. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there.
Yeah. You're just like, you're looking at something else. You're reading something, aren't you? You are.
I'm making sure, I'm actually checking on something, making sure that I agree with you. Go ahead.
Oh, you're just checking on the Twitter files?
Yes. No, we're losing the formal freedom because
that formal freedom is protected in the United States and in the Bill of Rights, which stipulates that the state will not, censor or negate the free press.
Right.
And that includes individuals. They won't abridge the rights of individuals to speak. It doesn't have to be a journalist or own a press. And so when now we're under a condition where the state is abridging our freedom in that way, we're losing a formal right. Maybe not one that's completely positive, definitely not one that's completely positively developed. But I would point out that in the early days of the internet, the fact that the distribution was instantaneous and that anyone with access to a library, a public library, or a university library, or anyone nowadays with a smartphone, which is a lot of people, can get access to these platforms without having to pay for them. They're not buying a commodity. It created a kind of positive freedom that we hadn't seen before. That's why people were, like the California ideology arose, because this seemed like it was more the technology had delivered a kind of freedom, but of course the capitalist relations behind that technology were in contradiction to it and set up this problem, really, that pushed us all the way to losing a formal freedom.
Right.
But nonetheless, my position as a Marxist is we should not accept the way in which capitalism works out its own problems, and should stand instead on the side of everyday human beings and workers to insist upon not just the formal freedom, but the actual freedom. And
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I would say about that is that I've already stated like my case law objections to it.
What was
It's
your
not
case law objections to it again?
It's
Just more
because broadcasting, like regulation, has been a trade-off to protect people basically from either civil litigation or from formal regulation by reinterpreting freedom of speech in a limited way. So and actually this is where like constitutional originalism doesn't help you. If you take a strict constitutionally originalist reading of the Constitution, you say, well, it only applies to press and to what you actually say, because that's what the little words say. Now, by extension, we know it's really about communication, but during the 20th century, that's been chipped away at.
Yeah. But I mean, recently there were cases where the regulatory state was limited in what it could demand from institutions because of the First Amendment. And in this particular case, establishing a regulatory function is, I think really difficult. First of all, these aren't regulatory bodies. Okay.
This is a whole other thing. The thing is,
I mean, this is not being done.
There's a strong legal argument that while collusion, I'm going to asterisk this, while collusion is a historical norm between the government and private actors, there is Supreme Court case law that while not 100% strong, because the strongest argument, I think, was the Blackmun argument, didn't win. I'm not a specialist on law, and lawyers can correct me, but I do know that like there was a free speech absolutist argument made, and it's actually made by a liberal. But that was not actually the deciding opinion. However, in general, it's what is interesting about right now, is that I don't think there is a single friend of free speech in the American legal system, although on particular issues, sometimes Republicans are better on this issue.
Clarence Thomas was the deciding vote on the issue that the case that I cited about the pregnancy center that won
exactly
First Amendment case. But it was probably idiosyncratic as to the way in which that was enforced.
Right. Unfortunately, originalism was always kind of a bullshit claim. But at least with Scalia, there was some attempt at it. But I know I'll have some law people get mad at me for that.
But see, this is we're going, see, like from my perspective, and I know this is sort of a simple-minded approach. Up until recently, people would be saying on the left, I am for free speech, of course. I don't.
Right, no, there's been a total inversion of that.
I don't support government censorship or abridgment of the free press, right?
Daniel Tutt and I actually talked about this, that like...
And now we have a moment where that is, for a number of... We can make really good arguments, some that I think would hold up in a court of law, but that are certainly justifiable to lead our politics. I mean, that politics and legal arguments are not the same thing.
Absolutely.
Right. And I don't really think that this should be worked out in the courts alone by any means. I think that, the left coming to a certain understanding of our situation and the understanding the value of free speech for us in this moment is a possibility. And instead of that, I mean, you frustrate me when you talk about the state has this regulatory function. It's like, that is the path towards accepting more and more censorship in the name of, I don't know, public safety.
But a description of a fact does not mean I accept the fact.
Okay, well, good. All right, that's fine. I mean, but to be clear about that, because even under these conditions, it's not. America is unique in the way to the extent to which it doesn't allow the regulatory state to impinge upon free speech. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I mean, I don't think you'd find the ruling that Clarence Thomas gave anywhere in Europe. I mean,
No, not even
right? Yeah.
Not even in good old England, where these rights are common law derived from, but which they have long since abandoned. I mean,
Right.
I was going to actually show a point of why I worry about the left in this principle issue, right? Because this is actually back you up a little bit, but why I think we have to state this on our terms beyond any immediate politics of picking between these fucking parties, is because the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, what was their primary goal? Was free speech on campus. How did they not have free speech on campus and local parentis laws being extended into the age of majority through educational exemptions? And thus the university having the rights of a parent, and a parent thus having the rights to limit your speech to some degree. It's moderated now by Supreme Court jurisprudence, but at the time there was no moderation. So that students didn't really have free speech even in public institutions. All right. So they fought the local parentis laws. And local parentis laws have been invoked in arguing for a lot of the campus moderation of who can speak on safety reasons. They've actually been done through reintroductions of local parentis laws. And ironically, reintroductions of local parentis laws that really began under the Reagan administration. So I think there is an empirical substantive case to what you're saying. And there's also separately from that there's an abstract principle. And I want to articulate the principle here. Equality and freedom in my mind actually are not opposed the way, say, Murray Rothbard would oppose them. All right. But they're actually dependent on one another. You cannot have.
Oh yeah, say it, because I agree.
You cannot have equality without freedom, if only in the sense that if someone has limited your freedom, they have to have the ability to do that. That ability is manifested through force. It's also going to be manifested in other ways. It does end up being a reification of a power distinction in both culture, but also in the means of production, through relations of production, meaning that without freedom, there is no possibility of an equal society. Why? Because there's always going to be someone who is a person to adjudicate that if people are not free to speak and come up with this stuff on social consensus values, which is why I don't think you can separate. I don't think you can separate the one that we always forget is fraternity, but it's always conservatives who point out the contradictions between liberty and freedom. And I'm like, well, we can do
you mean equality and
freedom. Yeah. Equality and liberty. And I'm always like, yeah, but there's also no way in which you can have equality without freedom. So maybe you can have freedom without equality. I'm not sure that
one person might.
Yeah, as an individual, you might.
Dr. Doom in Secret Wars, where he has all the power of God and can dominate everyone, he could have, but otherwise,
Right. Actually, you're right. If you're in that system, the person, if you do not have equal power, and equal power is going to be tied to equal access to the fruit and ability to decide your role in production. You literally cannot ever be completely free because you are mitigated by an unequal access at birth to material, and thus you are unable to but you're more compelled by accidents that have nothing to do with your own being. Just it has to do with
and we don't have to have
capital.
some and we don't have to reach for perfect equality or uniform equality here. But the point is that these freedom and equality, like you said, are connected. The more constrained people are overall, the more people are constrained, like numerically, the more people are constrained, the less equality there will be.
Right.
And
in general.
That's just in general. So absolutely. So, what has bothered me, and this is maybe just because I'm so caught up in left bullshit, it's just this slow erosion of any commitment to freedom, and particularly of free speech. Because for me, that's maybe because I write books and make videos and things like that, but also just because I think I can justify the idea that if we cannot speak freely and think freely and associate with each other freely, then we will never have any other form of freedom.
Right.
I mean, now to say that is maybe overstating, because we could be driven underground and have to develop networks of freedom and speech between each other. But to the degree to which we don't recognize that the need for it, there's the degree to which we're unlikely to do that, even under conditions of massive oppression.
Our disagreement was merely on whether or not I thought the Constitution was sufficient grounds to base that on. And I think to some degree, yes, although I sometimes go back and forth on this, but there's a proprietarian interest in the Constitution that has to be dealt with, because it actually cuts against this. And I also think if we were to win against the state, our next goal has to be to actually gain control of these mediums, because otherwise, we will never really have free speech on them. There will always be an incentive to, but there's other things we have to do between that. We have to, for example, both.
But but in the meantime, though, we do have the capacity to say to our elected representatives, if you continue to support the abridgment of free speech, you're losing my support. And as leftists, we should know that they're going to continue to abridge our free speech, and the Democratic Party should lose our support over this. I'm not saying that Republicans should gain it. I'm just saying that this should be
this is a good time to our parent room topic, because I am struck by two ironies. One is, I think for a lot of millennials, their repetition compulsion, their relitigation stance is not going to be a war, which it should be. It should be the Iraq and Afghanistan war, but it's going to be the Trump election, which is a farce.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.